Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. You are looking live at episode 41 of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Jimmy Sengenberger coming to your way. Stay tuned.
And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they wanna understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, doing our level best in partnership with the Washington Examiner to make sense out of nonsense. Just had to hear Biff Gore sing that one more time. Welcome back to the program. Another day here on Tuesday, the 12th of May. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. Thanks so much for joining us on the show that brings engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, and a great program we have today indeed. Let's talk about what we've got on our lineup. Coming at the bottom of the hour, Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State for Ohio. He's on the board of an international elections organization and also is a former mayor of Cincinnati. He's got many different titles that he has worn, but he is an expert when it comes to elections. And I'm looking forward to talking with Ken Blackwell about the subject of vote by mail and the Democrats' rush to vote by mail in 2020. We'll talk with him about that first up. Then Craig Cecilio will join us here on the show. He is CEO and founder of Diversy Fund. And I'm looking forward to talking with him about the economy and what we're seeing right now as far as some of the economic data coming about and what to keep in mind perhaps a little bit from an investment perspective and more. And then Avik is the founder and president of the Foundation for Research in Equal Opportunity. And I'm looking forward to talking with him as well, because we're going to dive into the FREOP plan for reopening America, what they're proposing, some of the data that we're learning about how nursing homes are about 40% of American deaths to COVID-19, which is a startling statistic and should be a guiding point for public policy. So we've got a lot to talk about with Avik. The theme of the show is Jimmy's looking forward to this one, it seems, because I keep saying that phrase over and over again. We've got Ken Blackwell, Craig Cecilio, and Avik all joining us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And by the way, programming note for Thursday, I'm very excited at the bottom of the first hour of the show to welcome on to Jimmy at the Crossroads, Mark Cuban, who is, of course, one of the co-hosts of Shark Tank, a billionaire, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. We're going to hash out some of his thoughts on government's role in addressing the current crisis that we face economically. Looking forward to discussing that with Mark Cuban. Just so much to look forward to this week. That's what's going on. Once again, you're watching Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. So let's jump right into a couple of different topics. You know, yesterday we talked a good bit about Michael Flynn and the saga of Michael Flynn, the travesty of how he has been mistreated. And President Trump and his administration, his Justice Department, under the direction of Bill Barr, Attorney General, decides to move to drop the charges against Michael Flynn for lying to the FBI. Well, the media has been sanctimonious and self-righteous about it, as have politicians. We've talked about Barack Obama yesterday, and James Comey, and Andy McCabe, and Brian Stelter over on CNN. Everywhere you turn, they're taking this issue of Michael Flynn and the effort on the part of the Justice Department to drop charges against him, which clearly were, as Sidney Powell, his lawyer, put it, orchestrated. It was definitely an orchestrated setup. The facts bear that out very clearly if you actually look into it. Well, apparently there are 2,000 or so legal minds, former DOJ personnel, who are just all in a tizzy over the fact that these charges, the idea of them being dropped, was put forward by the Department of Justice, filed as a motion with the court and Judge Sullivan. Here's one example of one of those legal minds over on MSNBC, Neil Katyal. This is Cut 8. Take a listen. This is from yesterday on Morning Joe.
I think it's outrageous and indefensible, and one of the greatest threats to the rule of law that Trump has done in his 3 years. I mean, this is really serious stuff. You've got a guy who was formerly the president's top aide, the national security advisor, who twice pleads guilty in 2017 and 2018, saying, look, I did it. You have the president at the time saying, look, you lied not just to the FBI, but to the vice president, and I'm firing you. And then yesterday, the Justice Department just decides all of a sudden to drop this prosecution. It's such a corrosive thing to the rule of law, the idea that justice is supposed to be blind, that you don't get third, fourth, fifth looks by prosecutors just because you happen to be Trump's friend. And now there's one form of justice for Trump's pals and one form for the rest of us. And that is, the most corrosive thing one could imagine to the rule of law.
The rule of law. Where did I hear that? Oh, Barack Obama on Friday. He was the first one I had heard to suggest the idea, this is an erosion of the rule of law. And clearly the talking points has spread out from what Barack Obama said on Friday. Let's look at this from a standpoint of full honesty. When you look at what happened in terms of how the FBI brought Michael Flynn, I think it was January 24th, into a meeting, they didn't suggest to him that he was a suspect and might need to have a lawyer present. He just went there thinking it was a friendly sort of meeting, and they planted all the seeds to get him to lie. He did it. He shouldn't have done it. But there was no proper pretext, as we talked about yesterday, for this investigation in the first place of Michael Flynn. And yet they did it. But what's also even more egregious is that Barack Obama, then president of the I guess on January 24th, he just left office. But on January 5th, when he was still president, he had that now infamous meeting with Sally Yates, Deputy Attorney General, and with James Comey, then FBI Director, in which it was clear that Comey and Obama were on the same page. They knew what was going on with Flynn, whereas Sally Yates had no clue. No Trump fan, again, as we talked about yesterday, no Trump fan whatsoever. But she thought something was awry. It didn't make sense to her. It didn't make sense. As she listened, she was trying to process the information according to the notes from Bob Mueller's team. So when you consider all the things that led up to that, you have to take into account those facts. You cannot just leave them out. And for Neil Katyal to make that claim, as everybody else is absurd. It's not a violation or an erosion of the rule of law when the FBI eroded the rule of law with how they conducted this. And by the way, Michael Flynn's lies to the vice president of the United States, okay, he lied. Maybe the Trump administration shouldn't bring him back in. But that is not a criminal offense, even though he shouldn't do it. We have to keep in mind the fact pattern, how it came about, and that bringing up, as Neil Katyal did, the fact that Michael Flynn lied to the vice president is irrelevant in terms of the legal prosecution. It's irrelevant in terms of the prosecution. It is fully relevant when it comes to the idea of should we hire Flynn back? But that's about it. Not whether or not there should be a legal prosecution. Now, speaking of the media and speaking of MSNBC, there's one other clip I wanted to play unrelated to the Michael Flynn story. Cut 3. This is sort of a laughable Steve Schmidt who, remember, Steve Schmidt is never Trump Republican, so very strongly, and the media, MSNBC loves bringing him on because he likes to blast every Republican at every chance that he can get. Now former Republican strategist. He also was briefly on Howard Schultz's campaign. Remember that short-lived independent bid for president on the part of the Starbucks CEO? He was briefly on that campaign, probably got a very nice contract, and then they realized, this just isn't practical. So here's an exchange real quickly between Steve Schmidt and Ari Melber on MSNBC.
The disaster of the response is hard to articulate. It's an epic disaster that Donald Trump has brought to this country. It's one of the great crises in the history of the country. And the truth of the matter is this. If Barack Obama was the president of the United States, this would not have happened. We would have had competent professional people. We would have done what we needed to do early. What would have happened is what happened during the Ebola crisis. We would have had someone like Ron Klain in charge of it, not the confederacy of dunces that we see running around the West Wing. We waited for months. We see the Blame China campaign starting, but it is the ineptitude and incompetence of Donald Trump, period, full stop, that is responsible for the catastrophe in this country, and no amount of gaslighting, delusion, fantasy happy talk changes that reality on a day-to-day basis, as we will recover from this over a period of years. Because of the 2 months where Donald Trump was on a revenge mission, hate tweeting, and paying attention to all manner of stupidity, everything except his essential duties, which were to protect the American people. And he has failed his duty in a way that no president in the history of the American Republic ever has, period.
Period. Longtime Republican strategist Steve Schmidt. Thank you for your clarity and your time tonight, sir.
Your clarity. Oh, Steve Schmidt, thank you so much for your clarity. You were just unequivocal in your Trump bashing. What was in that statement that Steve Schmidt just made that was substantive, of substantive value? Did he realize that Barack Obama's administration failed to replenish a stockpile of PPE? Bringing us down in the troubles on the early part of this pandemic? Did he recognize that Barack Obama, you look at how Ebola was handled, okay, that was, it seems fine enough. But here's the thing. Barack Obama, like Joe Biden if he were president, Hillary Clinton if she were president, they would be having a nationwide lockdown that would be incredibly rigorous. And that's not, as we'll talk about later with Avik Roy, that is not even close to what we need or should be putting into place. All that Steve Schmidt was providing there was very strong language from a former Republican that they can tout. No substantive value, no real clarity. Okay, he was clear in his hatred. That's about it. Don't see the substantive value in having a guy like Steve Schmidt on any cable news channel. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State for Ohio, here on the show. We're going to dive into the question of mail balloting and the rush for mail ballots across the country that Democrats are trying to move forward with at this juncture. Make no mistake, that's what their objective is. They want it in the next CARES package or whatever they want to call the bill. And we need to beware that exact approach that they're putting forward. Keep it right here. Jimmy Sengenberger coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner.
Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics.
Certainly we want to be safe. We want our fellow citizens to be safe. But there is never a time to short-skirt the Bill of Rights.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense.
And now, the further future adventures of Starship Winkler.
Thanks for coming to this medical convention with me, Captain. You're a true friend.
You promised there'd be green women.
Well, I'd like you to meet some of my colleagues. This is Dr. Scholes, podiatrist.
How do you do?
And this is Dr. Pepper.
Gesundheit.
Oh, and here comes Dr. Phil. He's a psychiatrist.
Well, every pancake has two sides. And
You're right, Doc. He is boring.
I'm right here.
And this is Dr. Spock, child psychologist.
Goodgy.
And of course, this is Dr. Octopus.
Oh, hello. How do you do?
How do you do?
How do you do? Hi, give me 5. Pleased to meet you. Give me 5. How do you do?
You do.
So, Doc Ock, what's your field?
I am a proctologist.
Oh, I wish I hadn't shaken all 8 hands.
Well, did the captain bring enough hand sanitizer? Tune in next time when we hear...
And this is Dr. Quinn, medicine woman.
Finally, a woman.
Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya?
Ugh.
On
Starship Winkler.
We interrupt this program for a very important presidential message.
I'm Donald Trump. As you know, people of America, the elections are coming up in November, and I have some very distressing news for you. Very distressing and disturbing. Did you know that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are both porch pirates? Do you know what that is? There's hundreds of hours of video evidence of Nancy Pelosi coming up on your porches and jujitsuing your precious packages. Well, Chuck Schumer waits in the street in the getaway van because he's too afraid to be a man and do his own dirty work. She has to do the dirty work just like she always does. Remember that this November when you go to vote, a Republican would never do that. He'd never take your precious little tot's choice. Never. And so think of that when you vote this November. Thank you very much. God bless and have a great day.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Ladies and gentlemen, back to your host of the Crossroads on harmonica, Jimmy Sengenberger.
Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads, where sometimes I just feel like whipping out my harmonica. One of them anyway. Just, I lost a case of harmonicas that has 7. I have no idea during this quarantine where I lost it, but I couldn't find it, so I ended up getting 7 more harmonicas last week, and they just came in the mail over the weekend. Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and the place where we do our level best to make sense out of nonsense day in and day out. And I'm pleased to be joined today by the former Secretary of State for Ohio, who's also on the board of an international elections organization, to dive into this push for mail ballot, all mail ballot elections across the country. Mr. Ken Blackwell joins us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Sir, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hey, Jimmy, it's good to be with you.
Did you enjoy a little harmonica there?
I sure did.
Yeah, occasionally I just feel like going ahead and playing a little bit. So why not,
you're probably too young to remember that Stevie Wonder was really good with the harmonica.
He still is.
and I was really into Stevie Wonder.
So I gotta love it.
it.
One of my favorites has been Howlin' Wolf. I also absolutely love Junior Wells. So very much of the blues orientation for me.
Yeah.
But Stevie Wonder just has that sound, and I think he uses chromatic harmonica a lot of the times, which I don't have one. I can't use that. He's pretty darn impressive. So welcome to the show. How are you?
It's good. I'm doing just fine. At 72, I in fact do social distancing, but the reality is I'm ready to reopen our economy, get people back to work, and regain our position as the most robust economy in all of human history.
So let me ask you this question then, before we jump into the 2020 election and this push by Democrats in particular for nationwide vote by mail scheme. What do you make of the debate over reopening? Because there are some who are saying we can't do it too fast, we can't get this thing started, we might need to wait months until finally testing's ready, what have you. What's your take on that?
I went back and I took a look at the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And we were very smart then. It had a greater impact in terms of the number of people impacted and the number of deaths that were associated with it. But we, in fact, held an election in 1918. But in terms of the economy, look, it's not an either-or situation. We manage risk every day of our lives. If you are not managing risk, you're dead. And so I work from the assumption that the American people are smart. The American people in January were in the midst of a very robust economy. Jobs were plentiful. People were working. Incomes had lifted. And we had renegotiated a trade agreement that would reposition us as we go forward into this third American century. I believe that the economy, because of all of the things that are in place in January, we will have a V-shaped recovery. But we have to be smart, which we are as an American people. Look, Americans don't have a death wish. They, in fact, they love liberty, and there has been an assault on liberty and an imbalance of taking public health precautions, putting protocols in place, and reopening our economy. The fact of the matter is that if we let our economy slip into a depression, a sustained depression, we will have more deaths, more sickness, more misery. And I think the American public has taken as much misery from this economy being shut down than they're going to tolerate anymore.
Ken Blackwell, just one more question on this, because you were mayor of a major city, Cincinnati, Ohio, and of course we have seen cities are very much the hotbeds, if you will, of the pandemic because of the population density. What do you make of major cities and how they're handling it, how they might handle the reopening in order to do it effectively without making sure that, or in a way that ensures that the virus doesn't spread like wildfire?
Look, first, there's great diversity in American cities across the full spectrum of metropolitan areas. I believe that mayors can put in place public health protocols that will allow them to practice not only hygiene, but good public health policies that would mitigate the spread of this virus. I think that we have to understand that we are within the context and framework of our federalism. At the local level is where services are executed. Anybody that's calling for the federal government, the central government, to run this is in fact leaning into federal socialism, which is something that the American people will not tolerate in the final analysis of things. So I think smart mayors will do smart things and put their people back to work and mitigate the threat of this virus. I've watched as we transition into a discussion about the elections. In 2014, Liberia was wrestling with Ebola. They had a major election, and the question was this fledgling democracy going to suspend its lean into democracy, or whether it would take public health precautions that would allow them to preserve their movement towards a vibrant democracy. They chose the latter, and they in fact had a successful election. If that developing country could do it, we can do it. And so not only can we put folks back to work, there's no reason why we can't have successful in-person elections in those communities, those states that have traditionally had in-person elections.
Again, we're talking with Ken Blackwell, who's former Secretary of State for Ohio and also is on the board of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. So let's dive right into this topic of what I think both of us would agree is a rush to mail ballot elections. Now, we'll talk about the viability of vote by mail specifically in a more general context in a few moments, because I don't know if we may differ on that. I'm not opposed to mail ballots. I live in Colorado. I think it's worked pretty well here overall in our state, although we absolutely need to be buttoning up voter ID requirements. But what really concerns me that I don't think people are thinking about is the fact that there is a rush here. In Colorado, as with Oregon and Washington, we're the first three states that implemented it. Utah and Hawaii are the two additional ones that have vote by mail statewide now because of county by county expansions. But in our experiences, it took a decade or more to build up to a point where you could actually functionally carry out vote by mail elections. And I don't understand why we're seeing such a rush when a lot of states are just not even close to being equipped now, Ken Blackwell.
As I crisscross the country over the 30-odd years that I've been involved in elections other than those that I've been involved in personally, one of the things, there's a simple concept called the chain of custody. In in-person balloting, in Ohio, for instance, you have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans on county boards of elections. We have 88 counties constructed that way. We have in-person precinct voting. Neighbors and church members and family members all can eyeball the process. There's a great transparency, and that builds voter confidence in the result. There are double lock systems that protect the system from the locks from being picked and manipulated and exploited by those who want to do things that are untoward and fraudulent. Therefore, the question becomes, with this mad rush, without the preparation that you're talking about, and a total collapse of the federalist system, because we have one national election day, but we have 50 state election systems managed at the state and local level. And it's that diversity that actually protects us against both internal and external evildoers and wrongdoers who would like to manipulate the outcome. So, Jimmy, look, the reality is this. Those states that have in-person voting, there's no reason for us to have that practice sidelined in this mad dash towards a system that, as you just mentioned, if you just implement it right away, won't have the safeguards, won't have the chain of custody that ultimately will build public confidence in the result that we have on election day.
No, I think that's such a series of important points, Ken Blackwell. And I would also add, I'll quote for a moment from my own op-ed in the Washington Examiner on Friday, where I note that electronic poll books and accurate databases must be properly generated with verifiable voter signatures. You also need to keep in mind that voting centers and ballot counting locations need to have strong broadband connectivity and a system that can handle the load. You need to make sure election judges are adequately trained, thoroughly understand how to adapt to the system, as you point out, a one-size-fits-all approach is doomed to fail. And not only that, in talking with experts here in Colorado, I've noted that there are only a handful, very small handful, of ballot printing companies across the country. Remember how Democrats were all worried of states competing against one another for ventilators or for N95 masks? Now, it never really ended up happening the way they were projecting, but they were worried about that. That's what we're going to have if you force a vote-by-mail system across the country. They're going to become the new ventilators because printers, there aren't enough to handle the load.
Well, you're absolutely right. And those that are now advocating this wholesale thrust into all mail voting or trying to exploit and foment public fear. And the reality is that we are on the path of mitigating the spread of this virus. We, in fact, have to have an economy that is robust enough to take advantage of the genius of the American people and the private sector to create the masks, the ventilators, the other health equipment. And we have to pull on the fact that historically, the American people have not tucked their tails and run from challenges, but we've taken challenges head on. And we have to push back on all sorts of assaults on our culture of liberty and understand that we are smart enough, we are rich enough as a nation, and we are aggressive enough in confronting challenges that we, in fact, can win this, and we can have an election in November that meets the confidence of those that were the results, meets the confidence test of the voting public.
Just a few minutes left with our guest, Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State for Ohio and also on the board of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Let's talk about election integrity for a moment. I mean, that is really what this comes down to. Yes, we want to maximize the ability for people to go and cast ballots, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you sacrifice election integrity in order to pursue some sort of ends. Let's just presume, and I think the data is very mixed in terms of voter turnout. You don't have demonstration that voter turnout really increases noticeably and necessarily by switching to vote by mail. But even if you assumed something along those lines, the idea that you can rush it without putting those systems in place, the structural things that are needed in order to make it work well, means that people cannot trust the voting the results. I mean, you think about what the Democrats were saying for years on Russiagate. They wouldn't even accept because Russia spent, what, $100 grand on Facebook ads or something? And now we're supposed to think that that vote by mail and rushing that isn't going to be some sort of impediment? I think Vladimir Putin would smile if we did this rush.
You're absolutely right. And the American people are not going to stand for this federal fiat that Nancy Pelosi and others are pushing. And again, I think they will fail as they try to exploit fear. I know that one of their operating notions is that you never let a crisis go to waste, and so look, what we have here is a fundamental clash of two worldviews. You have, the worldview of that's manifested in an opportunity society, and you have, the sort of central government socialism worldview that believes that governments can make better decisions than families and individuals. I happen to come from a family that believes that the family is the incubator of liberty, and that the government is not the grantor of our basic human rights. Yeah. And so when I see government trying to replace its God with itself, I think there's an automatic pushback. I know in me, in my family, and I see it across this country. Yeah. Our freedoms are not grants from government. They're gifts from God. They are an innate part of our human dignity, and we have to fight. and we will do it both economically and electorally and culturally.
Sure. Just one final question, because we got to run. Vote by mail in general, what is your take on that? Not if a rush, but if a state decides to look into it, to start putting things in place, maybe over like Colorado's experience was a decade. Are you okay with that if a state makes that decision and they spend the time and don't rush it, or do you have issues with the idea of vote by mail overall?
If a state makes that, because I'm a federalist, and I believe that the people of each one of our states have the right to decide their electoral process. Again, I resist when this is imposed upon people who in fact want the in-person balloting and who resist this notion that we should tuck our tails in fear and not believe that we can have a safe election, in-person election in November. And I think Nancy Pelosi and team will see that there's a great American pushback against this sort of federal attempt to take over what is naturally a fundamental right according to the 10th Amendment of our states.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to keep in mind that the states are the place where we can test out these things and make sure that they're effective, and we should be doing that. Exactly right. Ken Blackwell, so great to have you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back.
Jimmy, good to be with you, sir.
Once again, Ken Blackwell, former Secretary of State for Ohio, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. We're going to take a break. Overdue for one. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit about what's going on with the economy right now and some things that you ought to keep in mind in terms of maybe some of the investing standpoint and so forth. I mean, we've got a lot of challenges that our country is facing right now. Make no mistake about it. We can persevere, we must, and we must reopen the economy. We'll talk about it more with Avik Roy coming up here in a bit. But we will dive into the economic issues with our next guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Stay tuned.
And now, the further future adventures of Starship Winkler. The captain and the ship's doctor are attending a medical convention.
And that's how gigawatts can be used to cure chronic incontinence. Thank you, thank you. And now I'd like to send everybody back to the buffet line.
Nice speech there, Doc.
Yes, nice speech.
Ooh, it's time for the keynote speaker.
So, which doctor is speaking first?
Doctor who?
The doctor speaking first.
Who?
The guy on first?
Who?
What's the name of the doctor speaking first?
Who's on first?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you.
Well, tune in next time when we hear
Third Base
on Starship Winkler.
Safe, unsafe. Very safe, completely unsafe. Extremely insanely safe. X Games unsafe. Who's there? What do you want?
It's me, Arnold. Don Trump, I need to ask you a favor. I need you to stop using my quotes and my movie titles in your speeches. When you talk to the public, it gives them the wrong idea that somehow I support you.
I can do whatever I want. I am, after all, Commander-in-Chief.
Ah, that's what I mean right there. You can't just blatantly rip people off. That is a movie that I was in, not you, me.
I can do as I wish, as I totally recall.
See what I mean? That was a great movie I did with Jamie Lee Curtis and James Cameron, and neither one of those two support you, and now you're using that. You can't keep on doing this.
That's exactly media true lie right there.
That's what I mean. You can't say that.
I don't know. Whatever became of us, Arnold? We used to be like brothers, like twins.
That's the last straw. I can't take it anymore. There's something wrong with you. You must have something in your brain.
It's not a tumor.
Ah, that's it. That's it. That's from Kindergarten Cop. You can't steal that.
You know what? You're fired.
You can't fire me. I don't work for you anymore. I quit.
I want you to get Pence on the line right away, Mike Pence. We're going to send him down to Mar-a-Lago, and we're going to put a stop to this Arnold business. Tell him to run. Go. Get to the chopper.
I heard that. Knock it off now, or I'll be back. Unlike you in 2020, I'll be back.
Get him out.
Hi, Jimmy. This is Bill Clinton calling your secret hotline here. I gotta keep it down because I'm calling from the doghouse here in Chappaqua, New York at our place. Don't even ask. All you need to know is she's on the warpath again. Oh boy. Hillary yelled at me for listening to you. I have to do it in secret. But I really admire your show. I really do. I'm calling to wish you the best. All the best. In the future and even right now. Oh, here she comes. Listen, I gotta go, but you got a great show and you're gonna do very well in the future, I'll tell you that much. Oh my God, I know it's gonna happen. She's gonna have me read chapters of her book again, put us both to sleep. I know what the title of her darn book should have been. Should have been called How I Dropped the Ball on the 2-Yard Line with 3 seconds left in the Super Bowl. I gotta go.
And ladies and gentlemen, back to your host of the Crossroads, Mr. Jimmy Sengenberger.
Rocking and rolling back, Jimmy Sengenberger here with you, coming in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Thanks for joining us. By the way, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. And while you're at it, to the Washington Examiner YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/Washington Examiner. Follow me and tweet at me on Twitter at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. And also, be sure to log on to the new website just released over the weekend, jimmyatthecrossroads.com. So great to be with you today here on the program, where we do our best to make sense out of nonsense, and we got some very troubling economic news on Friday. It wasn't surprising, but it was still shocking, and that is the unemployment numbers. 20.5 million more unemployed workers in the previous period, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Labor Department. We've also seen the labor force participation rate at its lowest level since 1973, when women were just starting to really enter into the workforce. Let's talk about this and some things to keep in mind during the current crisis situation with Craig Cecilio, who is CEO and founder of Diversy Fund, a tech-enabled platform that allows the everyday investor to build wealth like 1%. He's a markets influencer and public speaker who also hosts the podcast Driven to Win podcast. And Craig joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Craig, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So startling numbers there. Tell us what you make of it.
Well, I wish I had some good news. I think the unemployment rate might be closer to 25% when it's all said and done. So we'll see that creep up, they're saying. But, I mean, some good things. There's some good economic indicators out there. I saw something in the commercial space that May over May numbers on people paying their rent is pretty much the same from last year to this year. So that's a positive thing. I think they're trying to loosen some of the standards in the PPE loans. It's only 25% of those proceeds could be used for overhead. They're trying to increase that limit because a lot of the small business owners are saying, hey, I don't have a huge payroll. I can't use 75% of these funds just for payroll alone. I need it to pay for my inventory and other overhead items. So there's some positives there. They're trying to make those changes. They should make those changes more quickly. I'm not sure what they're waiting for on that. I don't know why it's not like snap the fingers to make those changes. But the uncertainty out there in having a second wave, I think that is on people's mind more than anything else as we kind of assimilate back into society. I think that is the biggest uncertainty and biggest fear that is out there. And how do we do it? And they're slowly rolling out how to do it across the country. It seems to me a pretty consistent plan is, hey, if you're a high risk, try to avoid contacting anyone, stay home. If you're kind of have any type of cold, stay away from people, practice social distancing. So it seems to be starting to happen. I know out here in California, you had a little bit of, I'm not sure if you're paying attention to what's going on with, I think one of the congresswomen, one of the senators out here in Elon Musk, and he was threatening to pull his plant. They kind of have to meet halfway here because he does employ a lot of people. We don't want to lose another plant here, another car plant out in California, because we'll be down to zero. So we want to keep him happy too. There has to be some kind of compromise here.
In fact, he just came out yesterday and said, I'm just going to reopen. We're just going to go ahead and reopen my plant no matter what the government says. So I thought that was a pretty strong move. I want to play a clip here. Fox News Sunday. Steve Mnuchin in Cut 6 was on. He's, of course, the Treasury Secretary in the Trump administration. And he was asked specifically about some of these numbers that we're seeing as far as the job totals and the unemployment rate.
Bureau of Labor Statistics says what they call the real unemployment number for April, which again includes people who are not looking for work or underemployed, is 22.8%. But again, that does not include, because the unemployment numbers for April stopped in mid-April, does not include the 7 million people who have lost their jobs since then. So aren't we talking close to 25% at this point, which is Great Depression neighborhood?
Chris, we could be, but let me just emphasize, unlike the Great Depression where you had economic issues that led to this, we closed down the economy. So it wouldn't be a surprise if you closed down the economy that in half of the workforce is half the people didn't work. And that's why we're very focused on rebuilding this economy and getting it back to where it was. This is no fault of American business. This is no fault of American workers. This is a result of a virus. And that's why the president and I were determined to put together the largest economic program ever to help American workers get through this. So you are correct. The reported numbers are probably going to get worse before they get better. But that's why we're focused on rebuilding this economy. We'll have a better third quarter. We'll have a better fourth quarter. And next year is going to be a great year.
Craig Cecilio, worse before it gets better, although he's sounding more optimistic as the year progresses. What do you make of it?
Well, it's kind of like what I said. It's closer to 25%. Mm-hmm. And I think it was that Bernanke, he's quoted in some article the other day saying, hey, this is not the same as the Great Depression. It's nothing similar to the Great Depression. That was a financial meltdown. Even the last recession was a financial meltdown. The banks are in a better position. This is kind of a pandemic. Plus, it's kind of a fear-based recession. So pandemic causes a lot of fear. So that's the biggest thing I think we really have to do is get the confidence going in people, get the confidence going in the consumer. Once we're able to stimulate back in society to get them to start getting back to work, starting to trade with each other, people going out, supporting small businesses, people going out, adapting to the new changes. Whether that's you have a favorite restaurant, maybe you could do right now, you could go out and you could order some food from your favorite restaurants or any kind of services to help them out. I'm feeling pretty positive overall, but the biggest uncertainty again, I think, is the second wave. What's that going to look like? How's that going to affect us?
Craig Cecilio, again, our guest. Let's talk a little bit about the market side of things and also maybe opportunities and things that people should keep in mind as you are CEO and founder of Diversy Fund. Right now I'm seeing the stock market sort of flat, but we've been seeing quite an ebb and flow over the course of the last few weeks, including on Friday we saw markets higher despite this terrible jobs report. How do you see the market dynamics as playing out right now?
Oh, well, one thing I can say, I think the top 1%, they've made a lot of money with these fluctuations in the market. And that's where we kind of came in and said, this is a great time to build wealth. This is a great time to take advantage of some opportunities. The middle class, this is where we kind of get decimated. This is where kind of that wealth gap just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They're fearful. They're losing their jobs. They're not sure how they can pay their bills. But around you, the wealthy are taking advantage of everything. So I think there's great opportunity for people out there. You just got to be kind of confident. You got to take care of yourself and you just kind of look for it. And there is a lot of opportunity out for you. As far as what you're saying about the market, I think it's still going to kind of go up and down based on the uncertainties that we talked about the second wave. And once we get through that, through that uncertainty, I think things are going to start taking off and getting back to normal.
Now, when you say opportunities out there, what do you look for? How do you look at the market or businesses and what have you and say, oh, they look like this may be an opportunity? What should people keep in mind from an identification standpoint? How do you identify those opportunities, especially when you look around you and you're thinking, there can't be any opportunities because we have a pandemic afoot?
There's always a lot of opportunities. With fear, people like to sell assets. They like to get liquid. They like to sell. And only buyers will buy at a discount right now. You have some companies that definitely need infusion of capital. So you go in and kind of partner with them and help them out. If you're in other kinds of real assets, such as real estate, I think the hospitality sector is really taking a huge hit. The retail center is taking some huge hits as well. They may continue to take hits throughout the next year. So there could be great opportunities to go in there and buy some assets as well. These are large dollar amount assets. These are things that technically institutions take advantage of, very wealthy families take advantage of. The average person doesn't have an opportunity to do that. And that's where we kind of built out a platform to kind of leverage technology to allow everyone that opportunity to take advantage of those investment opportunities.
In terms of the technology space right now, I mean, it's providing tremendous opportunities for people to get by here. I mean, we think about Netflix and DoorDash and all the different tools at your disposal to be able to get food and to buy products from Amazon and what have you. And then you've got companies like your own Diversy Fund that are focused on more the online space when it comes to investing and so forth. How do you view that in terms of investment opportunities? Because it seems to me that when you're looking for opportunities during a pandemic, a chance to make some money, to look out into the long term, you may want to be looking at companies that are doing well right now, because chances are it's going to be a long time where we're going to be seeing these online companies be fruitful.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies have started out in the digital space and kind of are 100% digital nowadays. There's some companies starting to move into that space, and other companies who have not and kind of are behind the curve and are going to suffer tremendously. So it's kind of looking at the underlying economics of those companies and seeing how their business plan, of course, who's running the companies themselves, and looking at how they're going to take their product into the digital space. There's a lot of opportunities to invest in these companies today. So just do your due diligence on them, and there is quite a bit of opportunity to invest in them.
Craig, Cecilio, when you look at the changing way in which people invest, I mean, your company focusing on the online space, a lot more of a focus in that regard. How have things changed as far as investing is concerned over the past several years as opposed to where things were maybe a decade ago? Because it seems to me that in terms of the strategies, but also the approaches and how the logistics of it all have changed quite a bit.
Yeah, I'd say just in the last 10 years, I think 7 out of the top 10 companies and valued are in the tech space. And I think 10 years ago was 2 or 3. So just within the last 10 years, you're seeing that happen. And it's in the future, it's probably going to be 10 out of 10 in the next 10 years. So, I mean, we're leaders now, working from home, making things easier for people to use. These pandemics aren't going to affect how you do your business. A lot of your staff can work remotely. There's a lot of positives. You can do a lot of the transactions all online. Really, there's no slowdown in the business. There's just more and more people are becoming more accustomed to purchasing online. I think there was like 72% increase in all technology platforms over the past couple months. And also, in addition to that, with people living more in the digital space, people who are on the fringe before are no longer on the fringe. So you have this really pivotal moment in time where the behaviors of people just kind of accelerated. That was beyond what we thought was going to happen. We knew people were going to be more and more in the digital world, but this just forced everyone to get into the digital world. And if you're not getting in the digital world, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah, I also host a radio show here in Denver on 710 KNUS, and I had a guest on Saturday who said his mother is like 97. And a few months ago, she would have said, if you said talked about Amazon, that she was thinking about, a river. as opposed to now where she gets everything from Amazon. So it really is the case that it has brought technology barriers have been broken down among the generations, especially because older folks need to rely on it now because they can't leave the house for their own health.
Yeah, it was like that stubbornness had to go away. It's like, okay, I am so stubborn, I'm not going to do it. Now it's like, this is what I have to do to survive. And now they're on it too much almost. They're on it all the time.
Sure.
I mean, Amazon goes every day, right?
That's a good point. What do you think people should know about navigating the waters in this pandemic situation, particularly because, I mean, and I like to talk about this with different guests, when you look at headlines and they can ebb and flow, oh, we finally have this treatment that looks like it might be really, oh, well, maybe the treatment's not as good as we thought. Or you look at the economy, hey, maybe there are some glimmers of hope, but then you get a very terrible jobs report and what have you. How do you examine the headlines and make a determination on whether or not there is more underneath the headline than just the headline, and when to kind of look at making a decision when it comes to investing?
Well, the medical stuff, you just gotta ignore everything until that just takes months, maybe years to get that going in. As far as the market, unfortunately it's on emotion right now, and so I'm always looking at the end of the day. I'm more looking at like a leading indicator based on leadership and how leadership's doing, and just kind of getting a pulse of how people feel about that leadership. I think that's where it starts, and then with the leadership, you have the consumer confidence coming up. So every day people are running on emotion, watching television, hearing something in the news, and they're reacting to it. But I think you could look a little bit more long-term, look how leadership, what they're doing. There's still a lot of noise there in the media. In some cases, I'm hearing some people are going into European news outlets, other outlets to get the news because they don't trust the American news channels anymore. So I find that rather interesting. And again, we're kind of going back to the pandemic itself. It's based on the data we're receiving. And sometimes if we're not receiving the correct data, it's hard to make good decisions.
And just a few minutes left with you, Craig Cecilio, our guest. Now, the one other thing that has been perplexing people, and we've talked with a few different folks about why there seems to be this dichotomy, but while we've gotten terrible economic news, we have also seen many days where the market seems to be going higher and higher. Not of course, record highs or anything. We're still far off from that. But nevertheless, we've seen very damaging economic data that has come out, especially Friday's jobs report. And yet investors seem to be shrugging quite a bit. What do you think is the basis for that? Why do you think that is?
Well, the GDP is going to come out, and that's not going to be really a great number either.
Sure.
But I think we're prepared for it because it's the pandemic at the end of the day. I think we're looking at this. This is just a unique circumstance in our history. Again, back to it's not a financial recession. It's because of this pandemic. Everyone has a real belief there will be a vaccine by next year. Hopefully there's one early 2021. I know a lot of misinformation is coming out with that as well. Some people are saying it's going to take 18 months. But with all the technology we have, with all the people coming together, all the private businesses, we should really essentially get a vaccine done by the end of this year or beginning of next year. So everyone's looking at that, how we're going to assimilate back into society, how we're looking outside the box and how we can help small businesses out, how the government is opening up its war chest to with the PPE loans, buying some back some bonds and purchasing more maybe some distressed assets as well. I think we're in a good position to overcome this. And then the last bit is just having that strong leadership. And if we could really have that strong leadership, I think we'll be okay.
Finally, I want to play a clip of Larry Kudlow, a chief economic advisor in the Trump administration, from Sunday talk shows. Cut 4.
Several things. Number one, as bad as those job numbers were, and I don't want to sugarcoat it because I think the numbers for May are going to be also very difficult numbers. It's going to take a while for the reopening to have an impact. So there's that. The second point is, inside the numbers, there's a glimmer of hope. I don't want to downplay the numbers, mind you, but there's a glimmer of hope. We had about 80% of it was furloughs and temporary layoffs. That, by the way, doesn't assure that you'll go back to a job, but it suggests strongly that the cord between the worker and the business is still intact. I think hopefully that has something to do with the $3 trillion of assistance, including the payroll protection plan. you know, all in on this. We're probably including the Federal Reserve's operations and the budget and fiscal work that President Trump has led with the bipartisan congressional votes. We probably had, George, $9 trillion worth of assistance going to 175 million individuals. It's a remarkable plan to attempt to stabilize a very difficult situation.
So what do you make of that? I mean, he's thinking that the reopening, it will take a while for it to actually have an economic impact that will set in. So how are investors to interpret something like that? Because I think he's right that even as we allow things to reopen, it will still take time before a lot of businesses decide to take that initiative and consumers to get out there.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it? I think the Great Depression. There's 43 consecutive months of economic decline, and I think this is just kind of a roller coaster, just went super fast. So with that, I think you're going to have a more faster recovery than that. So I mean, just compare us to back then. It's a completely different thing. I'm pretty confident it's going to be a lot faster recovery than that. And he's right. It's good to be conservative. It's good to measure expectations. It's going to take us a little while to get out of this. The big thing I always go back is the fear of the second wave. If that isn't as bad as people believe it's going to be, I think we're going to get out of it real quickly right there. That's when you might see it just really accelerate right after that time period.
I tend to agree. Craig Cecilio, founder and CEO of Diversy Fund. So great to talk with you today. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
You as well. Once again, Craig Cecilio joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. We're going to take a break here. And when we return, we will be joined by Avik Roy. He's going to give us a perspective on how we can actually reopen, why it's important to do it regardless of the pandemic, irrespective of how things progress in that regard, but also what needs to be done in order to do an effective reopening. He is founder and president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and I'm looking forward to talking with Avik Roy on the other side. And we'll dive in deep onto this topic because I think we really need to have thoughtful consideration of the next steps. Keep it right here. Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Concerned about that trade deficit? Looking for that magic solution? I'm Bill of Goods for ScamWow, the tariff towel. It's like a tax. It's like a fee. It's like a penalty. This tariff really sucks up the trade deficit. And the jobs we'll save are tremendous. This is for the House, the Senate, the POTUS. You'll be saying crap every time you use the ScamWow tariff towel. Look at this. It just does the work. Why wouldn't you want to pay twice the price for that washing machine? How much would you pay for this tariff? It'll make this microwave seem like it's brand new. And at only twice the price. Look at the way the tariff towel cleans your clock. Wow, look at that. So clean, you can see the future. You can see future tariffs coming from a mile away. Look at the way it polishes these stars. Boy, if that don't make you feel patriotic, huh?
I love paying extra. I don't even worry about it anymore, since the trade deficit will go down.
Look at this tariff. I love this tariff. It's like a security blanket.
All I can say is, scam, wow!
ScamWow compels other nations to use their own tariff towels on our stuff, making our goods more expensive overseas. Whoopee.
The micro tariff is for everything, for lumber, for steel, even solar panels. It'll melt that trade deficit down. I don't know. It sells itself, America. The ScamWow sells for 25%. But if you call in the next 20 minutes, because we can't do this all term, we'll give you the second tariff absolutely free. That's 4 tariffs for 25%. And it comes with a 5-year warranty. Here's how to order.
Call 1-800-RIP-YOU-OFF. ScamWow is not available in capitalism and is made in Washington. Beware of ScamWow grift. 1-800-RIP-YOU-OFF. Call now.
Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics.
Certainly we want to be safe. We want our fellow citizens to be safe. But there is never a time to short-skirt the Bill of Rights.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense.
Welcome back, Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Great to be with you, as always, here on the show that brings engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Once again, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. That is the place to go in order to really get a sense of all we've got in terms of the videos and more. And then also, be sure to check out the new website, jimmyatthecrossroads.com, as well as our partners at the Washington Examiner, washingtonexaminer.com. So over the weekend on Sunday, Steve Mnuchin was on the Fox News Sunday program, Treasury Secretary, and here's what he said about the need to reopen the economy.
But Patrick Harker, head of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, says if the economy opens too soon and the virus spikes again, quote, not only would this be a health catastrophe, but it would reverse the recovery as well. If that happens, he predicts, quote, a painful economic contraction of GDP in 2021 as shutdowns are reintroduced. Do you agree that there is a considerable risk, not to say you shouldn't do it, but there is a considerable risk to reopening both from a public health and an economic standpoint?
Chris, if we do this carefully, working with the governors, I don't think there's a considerable risk. Matter of fact, I think there's a considerable risk of not reopening. You're talking about what would be permanent economic damage to the American public, and we're going to reopen in a very thoughtful way that gets people back to work safely, that has them social distance. One of the things we've seen, Chris, is a lot of businesses can do telework. Not everybody has to come back into the office at the same time, but people will be able to go into stores. Some of them will have reservations when they go in, but businesses will be able to reopen. And I think, as you know, certain parts of the country had very devastating impacts, like New York, and certain parts of the country didn't. And this is all being monitored very, very carefully.
Permanent economic damage. That is what Steve Mnuchin is projecting. And as we said yesterday, I think that is exactly the case. I think he's absolutely right that we just might have permanent economic damage. And we need to make sure that we mitigate that too. The fallout from the economic travesty that is befalling upon this country right now, particularly because of the government. We've talked about this many a time on the program. The government has enforced these shutdowns, putting them into effect. Now, as we've also noted, that does not mean that suddenly everything is going to go back to normal even if you reopen the economy. Businesses will make a decision. They will have to slowly move. A lot of businesses won't reopen fully. A lot of people won't go to restaurants and so forth. There may be some places where people will do that. But in a lot of cases, they won't, because they're going to be taking their own health precautions. But nevertheless, Steve Mnuchin is absolutely right. Permanent economic damage may well come as a result of this crisis if the government, the federal government, does not get it. Well, I guess it's not the federal government, it's state governments that are really doing these particular shutdowns. But the reality is that the reopening must happen. It is essential that the reopening take place because otherwise people will continue to suffer. The economic fallout will be devastating. And I don't know that the V-shaped recovery will happen. Now there's talk of a swoosh-shaped recovery. That's maybe more likely at this point. I think it really depends on how quickly we get the reopening going. That's what we need first. If we get the reopening going pretty quickly here, then we will be able to, I think, withstand some of this economic fallout and get things rolling again. But if we keep it going like this, the economic fallout will become permanent. And we need to watch out for that. And of course, we will always keep tabs on what's happening with the economy and all of that. So I want to play here cut one. This is Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, where she was talking about the pillars of a COVID-19 rescue bill. So we're going to get that queued up here in just one moment. And cut one here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And let's listen. Nancy Pelosi, this is on MSNBC with Chris Hayes.
So those bullet points that you just offered, some of the planks of the legislation that it's been widely reported that you are in conversation on. Yeah. Right. So the pillars are some sort of national program for testing and contact tracing, some kind of national program for both aid to states for their fiscal holes, as well as, I understand it, some kind of hazard pay, actually statutorily mandated hazard pay for frontline workers. Am I understanding that right? Or is it just funding for states who can then pay those workers?
I just want to take issue. There are talking points. These are the pillars of our plan to go forward, to make our own environment in a way that is, again, unifying and respectful of those who are sacrificing their lives, as well as of those who are feeling so much pain through all of this. This is what they need. This is meeting the needs of the American people. Among the provisions are, yes, there's state and local government to address the outlays that they have made in fighting the coronavirus, as well as the revenue that they have lost because of the coronavirus. And it goes all the way down to from states to small towns, and it is a result of how our members have brought back the concerns of their constituents, and I think it will have broad support among governors.
So that's Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, on MSNBC with Chris Hayes. You're watching Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, making sense out of nonsense, or at least doing our level best to do just that. Let's dive in to reopening the economy and how we can accomplish that effectively and why it's necessary even if the pandemic persists. Let's discuss it with Avik Roy, who is president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity and co-author of the Foundation's A New Strategy for Bringing People Back to Work During COVID-19, a report that they came out with at FreeUp. And Avik Roy joins us now. Avik, sir, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Thanks for coming on. So let me ask you kind of a big picture question for starters. In terms of the reopening, we have the debate going on about whether or not to reopen, what's involved in that, and so forth. What's your big picture perspective on the need to reopen? And I understand regardless of what happens with the pandemic.
Yeah, so our paper basically has 2 points. There are 2 points that we make. The first is that there's this conventional wisdom that, well, we can only reopen the economy after we've scaled up testing and we've developed an effective treatment and we've gotten immunity and we have a vaccine. The problem is we could fail at every single one of those things, particularly in the near to midterm. And that leads to the second point, which is that we cannot have the economy locked down at these levels for months on end. In fact, every week that goes by, small businesses around the country are closing because they're running out of cash reserves. So we have to get the economy reopened as soon as possible, and we have to do so in a careful way so as to continue to protect public health.
Now, in terms of the reopening question, I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying, and you alluded to this before, we need to meet certain testing metrics. We need to meet certain metrics when it comes to how it's being spread and what policies are put into place as far as social distancing and how effective those policies are working in particular areas. Much more intricate, even to get to the point where you can start widely reopening the economy. What do you make of that, and are those metrics tenable? Can we wait that long in some of these places? Or do we just need to start moving forward, although, as you point out, in a thoughtful way?
Well, there's a lot of oversimplification going on, particularly in the press, about testing. So, people, when you tell an average person, oh yeah, you get tested, they think of it as like getting your blood type tested or having a pregnancy test, tests that we know that have been around for a long time, that are super accurate and super easy to use. Testing for coronavirus is very different. Not all tests are the same, and not all tests are equally accurate, and not all tests actually measure active infection. There's certain types of tests that measure whether you're currently infected, but don't tell you if you've been infected in the past. There are other tests that tell you if you've been infected in the past, but don't tell you if you're currently infected. So you might actually test negative for COVID and be infected, because it takes 3 to 4 weeks for your body to develop antibodies to the virus that you're infected with. So for all these reasons, when people say, oh, we just need more tests and that'll solve everything, that's totally wrong, because there are a lot of tests that you can get that may falsely reassure you that you're disease-free, but you are actually infected and are going to get sick later on. So for all those reasons, testing is not going to be feasible at the population level. If you have all these people saying, well, we just have to have 2 or 5 million tests per day, and then we can test the whole country every day for coronavirus. Well, it's not going to work that way, because the tests that can actually test active infection involve these 6-inch nasal swabs that go up your nostril to the back of your head, and then you get this test 2 days later saying you're positive or negative. Like, you're not going to have 2 million Americans lining up for that service every day.
Again, Avik Roy, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. So when we look at some of these metrics that have been put forward, I mean, obviously the testing is one point that people consistently raise that we need to have, and you just addressed that point. But are there any other metrics that you hear bandied about quite a bit that maybe we need to take a closer look at before people say, well, this is something we need to use as a determining factor of whether or not to reopen?
Yeah, so you'll hear Anthony Fauci, for example, often say, well, if everything goes well, we'll have a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. There is absolutely no assurance that we'll have a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. We've been working for 35 years with the most brilliant scientists in the world to develop a vaccine for HIV. We still don't have one. We've been working for longer than that for a vaccine for hepatitis C. We still don't have one. We've never developed a vaccine for a novel coronavirus. The common cold is actually a coronavirus. We don't have a vaccine for that either. And there are a lot of technical reasons for that the virus mutates too often to create a vaccine that can last. But the point is, this idea that we're just going to bake a cake and snap our fingers and all of a sudden we'll have a vaccine, that's not necessarily true. And it's also not necessarily true that despite all the efforts from the pharmaceutical industry or the biotech industry, that we're going to have a treatment that wipes out the virus in your system in the next couple of weeks or months. We may get one in a year or two, but in the short term, we can't guarantee that. And again, it all comes back to how long are we going to keep 20 to 30 million people unemployed? How many trillions of dollars a month are we going to spend of our grandkids' money to keep the economy propped up while we wait for those things? We're going to run out of money soon enough, and we're going to run out of people who can continue to stay unemployed and on the economic sidelines.
The noted Nobel Prize-winning economist and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman came out with a new piece for the New York Times this week, and he said that this retreat from responsibility, that is the rush to reopen, won't just kill thousands. It might also turn the COVID slump into a depression. Here's how it would work, he writes. Over the next few weeks, many red states abandon social distancing policies, while many individuals taking their cues from Trump and Fox News businesses begin behaving irresponsibly. This leads briefly to some rise in employment, but fairly soon it becomes clear that COVID-19 is spiraling out of control. People retreat back into their homes, whatever Trump and Republican governors may say. So we're back where we started in economic terms and in worse shape than ever in epidemiological terms. As a result, the period of double-digit unemployment, which might have lasted only a few months, goes on and on. How do you respond to that one, Avik?
Well, if there isn't a website that compiles all the insanely wrong predictions that Paul Krugman has made about the economy,
so true.
Should be, maybe you need to do that, Jimmy, and enlighten the rest of us with all the confident things that Paul Krugman predicts that never come out to be true. And the key point here, Jimmy, is that Paul is exactly wrong. The people who are arguing that we have to lock down the economy forever in order to fight COVID-19 are the ones who are ignoring the science. They're the ones who are ignoring the evidence. In fact, we have lots of evidence and lots of science are from around the world as different states and different countries try different strategies in terms of how to prevent an overwhelming of our healthcare system from this disease. And there's been a lot of success with lighter touch strategies. I'm sure on your show you've talked about Sweden. Sweden is a country where they didn't completely shut down. It's not like they did nothing. They did ban sporting events. They did ban bars, crowded bars from serving people. But in general, they let the economy continue. And they found that there was no apocalypse. There was no spike in infections. They do have infections. They do have disease. But it's in the range of other European countries. And there has not been an apocalypse. In Florida, Governor DeSantis has been so heavily pressured to completely lock things down. He didn't. He let breakout regions like Miami-Dade County lock down, but rural areas didn't have to. That worked reasonably well. The idea that just because the New York subways are places where a lot of people are getting infected, that the rest of the country has to have the same policies as New York, that's the thing that's insane. That's the thing that's irresponsible. And tens of millions of people are losing their livelihoods because of irresponsible rhetoric from people like Paul Krugman.
Avik Roy is our guest. He is the president and founder of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. And I want to ask you, before we shift into what you guys are proposing as sort of the plan for reopening to do this effectively and safely, I want to ask you about sort of the trajectory that we've been on, not just economically, but also socially, many of the social consequences that come from this. I mean, it seems to me that public health officials are just narrowly focused, somewhat, I guess, understandably in a sense, but still narrowly focused on let's address COVID-19 and do whatever restrictions we think are maximally necessary in order to not just flatten the curve, but as Paul Krugman says, crush the curve. However, not only is there economic fallout that they don't seem to be taking into account, but there are also a heck of a lot of healthcare issues where people are not seeking treatment for other significant problems they may be facing, delaying treatment. Also, there are increases, it seems, in child abuse that's happening and going unreported because it's not being noticed at schools, for example. Maybe spousal abuse, depression, anxiety at fever pitches. I mean, there are so many social consequences that can really last a lifetime. And yet it doesn't seem to me that a lot of the advocates for an indefinite closure of our society are paying attention to that. Avik.
Well, it's absolutely true, everything you said, and more. Imagine the person whose cancer gets diagnosed after it's already spread to the rest of their body because they sat at home for the last 2 months. And so those are the kinds of deaths that are not going to be counted in the official statistics, but they're just as real and just as tragic as those from COVID-19. And by the way, there's something else that we should talk about we haven't touched on yet, which is that, we just put out a paper on this at freeop.org, our website, freopp.org. 40 to 50% of all the deaths from COVID-19 in the U.S., and by the way, in other countries, have occurred in nursing homes and other assisted living facilities. 1.6% of Americans live in those kinds of residences. And yet 40 to 50% of all the deaths are occurring in nursing homes and other residential care homes. That's tragic for a lot of reasons because a lot of state governments, New York and New Jersey in particular, forced nursing homes to accept COVID-19 patients to keep hospitals clear of those patients. And that led to the outbreak and spread of the disease in nursing homes. The silver lining of that tragedy is that the risk to everyone who doesn't live in a nursing home is actually significantly lower. And it gives us more reason to consider reopening the economy, particularly for school children who can go back to school and younger workers who can go back to work.
And it gives us a guiding point, I would say, Avik, for how best to go about this reopening. I think that's the perfect jumping off point to delve into that discussion, because it's not like you or I or anybody just about is saying just open everything up completely, don't worry about any guidelines, anything along those lines. There are ways to go about this smartly, strategically. Give us a 50,000-foot view of what the Foundation for Research and Equal Opportunity is talking about.
Right, so we touched on it a little bit. So the key thing in terms of the reopening is to know and to understand the evidence and the science, which is that COVID-19 is a disease that overwhelmingly affects elderly individuals. That doesn't mean you can't get infected if you're young. That doesn't mean you can't get sick if you're young. But it means the risk of severe illness and death if you're young relative to if you're old is a big, big difference. Based on data from the Centers for Disease Control, if you're over 65, your risk of dying from COVID-19 is 25 times that of if you're between the ages of 25 and 54. And if you're younger than 25, your risk of dying from COVID-19 is almost zero. It's like 3 in a million. So all that to say that we should look at that evidence, we should look at that data and say, yes, look, we should take precautions. We should clean our surfaces. We should engage in social distancing. We should engage in deep cleanings. But we can allow kids to go back to school with minimal risk to the hospital system and to death. We can let younger people back into the workforce with minimal risk to hospitalization and death. Now, of course, we should make sure that older teachers and at-risk individuals have the ability to stay home. We should make sure that kids who live with their grandparents don't necessarily go to school and get exposed from COVID-19. So you have to make those exceptions. But the majority of people can go back to school, can go back to work, particularly younger people. And that's one of the ironies of this whole thing, Jimmy, is that this is a disease that primarily adversely affects people over 65, but the working age population is primarily under 65, and those are the people we're forcing to stay home and not earn a living.
So when we look at the idea of sort of making a generational determination on who goes back and who doesn't, how do you think that can work functionally? Because we're in a society where you're supposed to be treated equally under the law regardless. So how do you see that being done from sort of a legal standpoint, Avik?
Well,
are there any challenges?
Winston Churchill once described capitalism as the unequal distribution of wealth and socialism as the equal distribution of poverty. And this is effectively what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about people who are saying, well, if some people can't go to school, then nobody should. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Those elites are saying, if you have a single mom who's a pharmacist who can't go to work because her 5-year-old would be left alone at home, that she should stay home, that her kid shouldn't be able to go to school. We should make sure that those kids are going to school. We should make sure that every kid who needs and can take advantage of the opportunity to go to school and go to work, and adults who go to work, that they can do so. And yes, for other people who need extra layers of protection, we protect them, and we ask them to stay home. But for everybody who can go to work to get that economy going again, they should, because their lives are at stake, their livelihoods are at stake, as well as everyone else's.
Now, when it comes to workplaces and enforcing these sort of social distancing guidelines, I was fortunate enough yesterday to get a haircut. And I went to a local sport clips, and I was remarkably able to get in there in about an hour, having checked in online. And I had to wear a mask, and when they got around my ears, I had to take off the ear hooks from the mask and hold it up to my face. And then when I went back and did the hair wash, whatever, then there was a process in place for that. And I was talking to the stylist, and she was telling me that she's so glad to be back to work. She thinks that the shutdown was excessive, didn't think that it was particularly appropriate, and she also is really pleased with how Sport Clips is handling it from a deep cleaning standpoint, for making sure that the facility has a process in place for protecting people to the greatest extent possible. And I felt more comfortable when the worker there was feeling very comfortable with what was going on, and also relieved to be back to work. And I think that provides some guidance for us, Avik, for how we should be reopening and how best to go about that as well.
So many points to make based on that story. The first is that, this impression that the Paul Krugmans of the world have, that somehow we're just going to go back to normal if we reopen the economy. No. Everyone is aware that we have to do a better job in terms of making sure we're washing our hands and using social distancing and all these different tools to make sure that we're being careful. And businesses in particular have a massive incentive to reassure both their workers and their customers that their workplaces and stores and establishments are safe. So you're not going to need to pass regulations to do that. People are going to do that on their own, because if they don't do that on their own, customers are not going to go to those hair salons or those restaurants. So that's an important thing to take advantage of. And by the way, another argument I've heard, particularly from people who live in Washington, D.C., is, well, there's no point in reopening the economy because people will be too scared to go to a store or go to a restaurant or go out. And, yes, there will be some people who err on the side of caution, but others are eager to get their hair cut and get a bite to eat with their spouse or loved one. And those people who actually do that, and as that happens and the cases and hospitalizations and deaths don't spike, that will be the only thing that can restore the confidence of those more cautious individuals to take that doctor's appointment or get that haircut. So if you cannot reopen the economy completely without reopening the economy partially.
I think that's such an important point, Avik Roy, and I look at it, too, from the standpoint of liberty, making it possible for businesses and individuals to make the determination whether or not to reopen, whether or not they want to go to a restaurant or what have you. But then also, it works in favor of the idea that the reopening will be a bit slower automatically, just by nature, because people will be taking their time, they'll be judging the circumstances, and that should give us hope that we can reopen effectively, at least get the economy started again, and then trust that people will be responsible when measuring their own risk.
That's totally right. And especially when you consider the huge variation in how COVID-19 has affected different parts of the country. The way we handle this in rural areas or in regions that aren't as badly affected should be very different than the way we handled it in New York City, where, again, you have a subway system. You have other things about New York, the way they've mismanaged their nursing home population, that affect the way you deal with the infection in that area and in the Eastern Seaboard in general. So it's really important to look at this regionally. It's very important to look at the evidence. It's very important to understand that coronavirus is not the flu. And what I mean by that is all the public health authorities are basically using these scripts, these playbooks that they're dusting off from past pandemics of the flu. And COVID-19 is not the flu. It's a different disease caused by a different virus, and it requires a different strategy.
Although one thing that strikes me about this situation is that while they may be using certain things from a playbook, we've never tried this playbook before of shutting down an entire economy virtually, Avik. This is unprecedented in terms of putting healthy people, young people, everybody, and saying, you all need to stay at home. That seems to me to be a bit of a different playbook, though.
Well, it's different in certain ways, I suppose, than things the U.S. has done in the past. But it is very much the playbook that is taught in every public health school about what you do in extreme flu pandemics. If you study the history of the Spanish flu of 1918, the lesson that most people in the public health world draw from that is, we should lock down the entire economy and then wait. And then you can start to gradually rebuild things. And again, Sweden, as we've talked about, Sweden didn't do that, and Sweden is just fine. Florida didn't do that, not to the same degree anyway, and Florida is turning out to be just fine. One thing, for example, that we're learning about COVID that's different a bit from the flu is outdoor transmission is much less likely than indoor transmission. The transmission of that virus, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, seems to occur in tightly enclosed spaces where a lot of people are crowded together. It doesn't seem to occur in brief encounters, it doesn't seem to occur in less dense spaces, and it particularly doesn't seem to occur outdoors. And yet when DeSantis refused to shut down the beaches, everyone yelled at him. Well, it turns out that he was right, that transmission in the beach is not actually that big of a risk. So there are a lot of things like that where we can learn how COVID is different from the flu, and that can help us reopen the economy. Because again, our goal is not to sacrifice public health in terms of reopening the economy. It's to find that sweet spot, that low-hanging fruit of things that we can do that are minimal in terms of their risk to public health, but maximal in terms of their impact on the economy.
Yeah, the idea that reopening is necessarily going to be averse to public health and to addressing the virus is just patently false when you look at reality and how both can go hand in hand. Just wrapping up, just two final quick questions. Since you mentioned 40% of the deaths we've seen have been in nursing homes, what do you think needs to be done in order to address those facilities and stop the spread there and contain it better?
A great question. We have a whole section in our free op paper on this topic. First, we have to do what a number of states are starting to do, which is restrict visitations to nursing homes to make sure that people, even family members who might be infected but don't know it, can't infect nursing homes and the people who live there. The next thing that's really important is you've got to make sure that the people who work in those nursing homes are sticking to a particular institution. What happens at a lot of nursing homes, particularly ones that are part of bigger chains, is you have a group of people on the staff who work at multiple nursing homes, and so they basically are the ones spreading the disease from nursing home to nursing home. So you have to find ways to restrict them to one nursing home and hire other people to handle the other nursing homes, and of course test everybody aggressively all the time who's working in those nursing homes and living in them. Those are some of the key things that we have to do. And one other thing we can do, so New York, New Jersey, Michigan, a bunch of other states have had these mandates where if you were discharged from the hospital with COVID-19, nursing homes were forced to accept you and take you in. Well, of course, what did that do? That spread COVID-19 to all the nursing homes. So you have to rescind those mandates, and you have to use maybe some of this excess hotel capacity, since nobody's traveling right now, to house those individuals until they're fully cleared of the virus. And then you can bring them back to the nursing home.
I want to ask a fundamental question finally here with you, Avik Roy, again, our guest, founder and president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. And that is the lesson we should learn from this crisis. And I've been asking different folks this question. There are some who say this underscores that we need a New Deal, that we need a massive expansion of the government in order to address crises like this and provide for the people into the long-term future. And therefore, the lesson is we need more government. Versus the other lesson, which is government is incapable of fully addressing these in a very intricate way. And we need to recognize that we cannot simply rely upon government, and we need individuals to be able to have the latitude to take initiative of their own accord. I mean, I look at trust in institutions in this country right now. We have a credibility crisis in our institutions across the board. And I think for me, I've never trusted government less than I do right now. And I think that's the case for a lot of Americans. And those Americans like me are looking and saying, you want us to trust you that you're going to have all of our best interests at heart and that all of this is going to work when I can't trust you in general right now. So how do you weigh that lesson and what people should take away from this crisis of the coronavirus, and then what you think people will likely take away?
Well, Jimmy, it's a great question. I think the honest answer is that it doesn't fall neatly into ideological categories. There's no doubt that the government is a big part of the reason why we're having this pandemic in the first place. If you think about the way the Centers for Disease Control and the way the FDA went out of their way to prevent people in Washington State and others from developing their own tests to track the people on the early side who had this disease. That was a huge failing of the government, of the bureaucracy. And there have been huge failings all the way through, like we've talked about New York and New Jersey and these mandates to force nursing homes to accept infected patients that helped spread the disease. There are a lot of experts that have advised the government who've been totally wrong in terms of their projections about how this disease will progress. All those things point to incredible disaster in terms of government legitimacy and correct government action on all this. But when it comes to public health crises, there is a legitimate role for the government in helping to facilitate the scale-up of testing and vaccines, to fund scientific research that helps us identify what's going on, right? So there is a role for government, but it's just a very different role than the one that we've seen up to this point.
I think that is the only real answer you can be looking at, which is government can be effective in certain particular areas versus the idea that we should, for example, expand to a Medicare for all program. I'm not going to get you off on that track because I know we could do a whole other half hour on that. But nevertheless, it is important to keep in mind that while there are a lot of things we should not be looking to government for, there are some narrowly tailored things that absolutely we can learn as being appropriate roles for government. Avik Roy, again, President, CEO, founder of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. So great to get your thoughts here today. I hope folks will check out freeop.org, FREOPP.org, so that they can check out the report. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Jimmy.
Once again, Avik Roy joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Always a pleasure and a privilege to get thoughts from thoughtful people who really understand public policy, who understand the role of government, who understand that government is not something that has incredible potential to just do everything. You need to recognize that there's a heck of a lot of things, not only that government maybe shouldn't do, but that government cannot do all that well. Let's keep that in perspective as we look out into the future. We need to reopen the economy. We need to get those economic gears rolling again. We need to trust the people to be responsible. Sure, there will be some folks who won't be as responsible as they should be. That's going to happen in any society. That already happens in our daily lives. We cannot just say you need to keep things under lock and key indefinitely. And I think the discussion we had with Avik, the plan that they've put forward at FREOP, and more underscores how you can do this appropriately and well. That is it for us today. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Thanks so much for joining us on Jimmy at the Crossroads. On Thursday, programming note, Mark Cuban will join us live at the bottom of the first hour. That's, 12:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Mountain Time. Looking forward to what should be a very interesting and engaging conversation with the billionaire star on Shark Tank, as well as owner of the Dallas Mavericks NBA basketball team. My thanks as well to our guests today and to Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, working the Matoush magic, and to our partners at the Washington Examiner. Once again, I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Check out the website, jimmysengenberger.com and jimmyatthecrossroads.com, and may God bless America.